Welcome to COIS ADMN 1620, Introduction to Information Systems. This is Chapter 4, Information Security. Learning Objectives. Identify the 5 factors that contribute to the increasing vulnerability of information resources and provide a specific example of each factor. Compare and contrast human mistakes and social engineering and provide a specific example of each one. Discuss the 10 types of deliberate attacks. Define the 3 risk mitigation strategies and provide an example of each one in the context of owning a home. Identify the 3 major types of controls that organizations can use to protect their information resources and provide an example of each one. Explain why it is critical that you protect your information assets and identify actions that you could take to do so. Chapter Outline. Introduction to Information Security. Unintentional threats to information systems. Deliberate threats to information systems. What organizations are doing to protect information resources. Information security controls. And personal information asset protection. Opening case, the Equifax breaches. Please read through the opening case in the book. Think about the following items. The importance of immediate response to software updates. Is your computer on automatic update? How could your credit rating be affected by identity theft? Again, as a reminder, these are the kinds of questions that you may well see in the short answer questions in an exam situation. Introduction to Information Security. We're going to cover 5 areas: security, information security, threat, exposure, and vulnerability. Introduction to Information Security. 5 factors contributing to vulnerability of organizational information resources are today's interconnected, interdependent, wirelessly networked business environment, smaller, faster, cheaper computers and storage devices, decreasing skills necessary to be a computer hacker, international organized crime taking over cybercrime, and the lack of management support. When we talk about the first factor, what we're talking about is the fact that the internet now enables millions of computers and computer networks to communicate amongst each other seamlessly, freely, and with, in many cases, not very many barriers. So everyone from an individual to an organization becomes exposed to untrusted networks and potential attackers. In the second factor, modern computers and storage devices are smaller, faster, and store more data. That makes it a lot easier to steal or lose a computer or a storage device, and it makes the amount of information that's on that correspondingly larger. People are much more able to afford really powerful computers and use them to connect through the internet, and therefore are able to mount attacks using these more sophisticated computers, which are affordable. The third factor, the computing skills necessary to become a hacker are on their way down. There are things called scripts on the internet that people that we call script kiddies can use, meaning people that have very little expertise in the area of hacking. And by leveraging the work that other people have done, it's become mostly plug and play as far as mounting an attack. The fourth factor, we have international organized crime taking over cybercrime. It's incredibly profitable. So the adversary is becoming much more sophisticated, has many more resources, and is very highly motivated. Whereas in the past, a lot of hacking was done for the fun of it and for the limited profitability that it offered. Now it's a business. The fifth factor is the lack of management support. That just speaks to the fact that if management at the highest levels doesn't take security and security procedures seriously, then the company is essentially vulnerable and possibly doomed. I know that in a case that I worked on when we were looking at a data breach in Athens, Georgia of an orthopedic clinic, the problem there was that senior management, actually ownership of the clinic, was too lazy or too misguided to use passwords that were more than 1 or 2 characters long. They didn't want the inconvenience of actually having to remember a password with multiple letters, numbers, and special characters in it. They wanted their password to be 1 or password or something really simple like that. So that tone at the top made them vulnerable, and they ended up paying an enormous price in terms of both fines, loss of data, downtime, and the services that the company I was working for provided. Unintentional threats to information systems. We're going to talk about human errors and social engineering. Figure 4.1, security threats. This shows some outside threats and some inside threats. Inside threats are by far more dangerous and more commonly result in successful hacking or penetration because insiders often have permissions already and they are generally trusted. Take a look at the diagram. We've got some internet vector attacks. We've got some natural disasters. We've got man-made disasters. And we've got on the inside part of the chart on the bottom, we've got employees from your application programmer to your systems programmer to your operators to your users, system software. We've got consultants, contract labor, janitors, and we've got hardware threats such as terminals, personal computers, and databases. This is a good figure to take a close look at and improve your perspective. Human errors, risk areas. Higher level employees plus greater access privileges make them a greater threat. So the higher the level of the employee, the more likely that person is to have greater access privileges, whether it's needed or not in their job, but they present a greater threat than a lower level employee that has very restricted privileges. 2 areas pose significant threats: human resources and information systems. The other areas of threats are contract labor, consultants, janitors, and guards. Human resources employees would generally have access to sensitive personal information about all other employees. Information systems employees not only have access to sensitive data, they also control the means to create, store, transmit, and modify those data. The contract labor, consultants, janitors, and guards. Consultants are technically not employees, but they do perform work for the company and they will have some sort of access. The janitors and guards have access after hours, at least physical access. And if good practices of turning off computers or locking out computers is not undertaken by the employees, they may have access directly as well. Table 4.1, human mistakes. Carelessness with computing devices, for example, laptops, tablets, smartphones, leaving them open, leaving them exposed. Opening questionable emails. Probably we're all aware of phishing emails at this point, though the sophistication of the user varies dramatically depending on their experience and education. Careless internet surfing. There's just some sites you just don't want to surf to. Poor password selection and use generally can be controlled by having policies that require a certain level of password selection. Carelessness with one's office, carelessness using unmanaged devices, carelessness with discarded equipment, and careless monitoring of environmental hazards. When we execute a search warrant on a business, we do go through people's offices, of course, and we look for the sticky containing the password. Often under the table, under the keyboard, in the drawer, wherever, and that's simply careless. I had an incident of an employee that had a RSA device that puts up different combination numbers that allows access to our bank account in combination with a user's password. So it's a 2-factor authentication because you've got this device that's synced to your account that you have to physically be able to read the combination that changes every, 30 seconds or so. And the user had a sticky attached to that RSA device with her password on it. So now you've put both pieces of information together and accessible to anyone that could open the drawer on her desk. Carelessness with discarded equipment. There are often company policies whether they're followed or not, for the proper disposal of IT assets, especially the storage devices in the computer, the hard drives, and various other storage devices. Social engineering. Social engineering is an attack in which the perpetrator uses social skills to trick or manipulate legitimate employees into providing confidential company information such as passwords. An example is Kevin Mitnick, who is a famous hacker and former FBI's most wanted. If you watch late night talk shows, you will often see a comedy sketch in them. Sometimes they will go down a street and they will ask someone for their password. The person will laugh at them and say, "No, I'm not giving you my password, that's private." They say, "Oh yeah, okay. So tell me a bit about yourself. Where did you go to school? What's your mom's maiden name? What's your pet's name?" Mixed in with a bunch of other questions. So what they do is they obtain the most common questions that are asked to authenticate services to maybe allow you to reset a password. And they just do it to demonstrate how gullible people are and how much putting a camera in their face puts them on a spot and they stop thinking about the information that they're giving out. The same thing happens all the time on LinkedIn, where someone will do a survey and they'll ask questions like, "What was the name of your pet?" Or they'll say, "Your porn star name is your first pet's name followed by your mother's maiden name," or something ridiculous like that. And that will give them two pieces of information, being your mother's maiden name and your first pet's name. So that is social engineering. Those are all examples of social engineering. Deliberate threats to information systems, espionage or trespass, information extortion, sabotage or vandalism, theft of equipment or information, identity theft, compromises to intellectual property, software attacks, alien software, supervisory control and data acquisition, SCADA attacks, cyber terrorism, and cyber warfare. Table 4.2, types of software attacks. Remote attacks requiring user action can be viruses, worms, phishing attacks, and spear phishing. A virus is a segment of computer code that performs malicious actions by attaching to another computer program. A worm is like a virus, except that it will replicate or spread by itself without requiring another computer program. A phishing attack is an attack that uses deception to get sensitive personal information. It may masquerade as an official looking email or instant message, in some cases even a text message. A spear phishing attack is just very targeted compared to a general phishing attack. It's a tailored phishing attack to improve the chances that it will work. Remote attacks needing no user action are denial of service attacks and distributed denial of service attacks. A denial of service attack is where an attacker sends so many information requests or pings to a target computer that the target computer cannot handle them successfully and it will crash. A distributed denial of service attack is the same thing exactly, except you have multiple computers that are sending these requests to the target computer. Those multiple computers are usually controlled by a single entity. They are called zombies or bots, and in combination they are called a botnet, and they are coordinated to send all these information requests to the target computer, which again accomplishes the same thing, it crashes. Attacks by a programmer developing a system, a Trojan horse, a backdoor, or a logic bomb. A Trojan horse is a software program that hides in another program. It seems innocuous because it seems to be just that other computer program. It reveals its designed behavior when it's activated. A backdoor is built into code. It's typically a password known to the attacker that allows them to access a computer at will. A logic bomb is a segment of computer code embedded within an organization's existing computer program. It's designed to activate and perform some sort of destructive action under special circumstances, and that special circumstance could be a time or a date. It's about business 4.1, whaling attacks. What we want you to consider here is how personal data can be used both for identity theft and for whaling attacks. that password theft via whaling can provide an unauthorized gateway to corporate data. It's About Business 4.2, an attack on the internet. Here we want you to consider that many computers could be part of a botnet and how high-capacity servers can help prevent successful execution of DDoS or distributed denial of service attacks. Alien software, also known as Pestware. There is adware, spyware, which include keyloggers and screen scrapers, spamware, cookies, which are tracking cookies. Alien software itself is clandestine software that's installed on your computer through duplicitous methods. In other words, you're tricked into putting it on there. Sometimes you'll download something and there will be an auto install function and you will just have to hit I agree as you go through, mindlessly often go through the installation process. It'll ask you if it's all right to install such and such a software. So that is alien software. It's not as malicious as viruses, worms, or Trojan horses, but it does use up valuable resources and it can track your activity. Adware is software that causes pop-up ads to appear on your screen. Spyware is software that collects personal information without users' consent. Common types of spyware are keystroke loggers and screen scrapers. Keystroke loggers are pieces of software that track every stroke of the keyboard. That will include anytime you enter a password, obviously, and screen scrapers, which will take pictures of the screen and send them somewhere else. Spamware is another form of pestware that uses your computer as a launchpad for spammers, so it allows people to use your resources to send spam. Spam being unsolicited email. It usually is sent out by the millions or the hundreds of millions, and it's advertising for products and services. Cookies have a legitimate function, and that is to note your preferences so that when you go to a website, if you have custom views or favorites or anything like that, there's a file on your computer that notes that preference. They're generally temporary in nature and they're generally useful and innocuous. Tracking cookies, however, track your path through a website, the time you spend there, the links you click on, other details that a company wants to record for their own marketing and other purposes. So they provide a lot more information than you're probably aware that you're providing. What organizations are doing to protect information resources? Risk is the probability the threat will impact an information resource. Companies are going to undertake risk management and risk analysis and use risk mitigation. The goal of risk management is to identify, control, and minimize the impact of threats. In other words, risk management is trying to reduce risk to acceptable levels. Risk management consists of three processes: risk analysis, risk mitigation, and controls evaluation. Risk analysis involves three steps: assessing the value of each asset being protected, estimating the probability that each asset will be compromised, and comparing the probable costs of the assets being compromised with the costs of protecting that asset. Then the organization will consider how to mitigate the risk. Risk mitigation comes in three forms: risk acceptance, risk limitation, or risk transference. Risk mitigation means that the organization is taking concrete actions against risk. Risk mitigation has two functions: one, implementing controls to prevent identified threats from occurring, and two, developing a means of recovery if the threat becomes a reality. Risk acceptance means that we accept the potential risk, continue operating with no controls, and absorb whatever damages that may occur. This is likely taken when the damage is not high, is manageable, or is such a remote chance of happening as to be nearly impossible. Risk limitation is limiting the risk by implementing controls that minimize the impact of the threat. Risk transference means that we transfer the risk by other means to compensate for the loss, such as purchasing insurance. It's about Business 4.3, the data breach at Desjardins Group. Consider, what are the resources required to carefully investigate a data breach? The seriousness of the consequences for individuals who leak or sell confidential data. Information security controls. Categories of controls: physical controls, access controls, communication controls, business continuity planning, and information systems auditing. Categories of controls. Security is only one aspect of operational control, which is part of general controls. Controls come in layers: control environment, general controls, and application control. The control environment. This encompasses management attitudes towards controls, as evidenced by management actions, as well as by stated policies that address ethical issues and quality of supervision. Figure 4.2, where defense mechanisms, general controls, are located. We have physical controls, which include guards or ID systems. Cards are biometric. That also crosses over into access controls. And we have authentication as part of that, as being needed to get into the corporate intranet. In the access controls at the bottom, we see a remote employee or attacker using a PC, a smartphone, or an iPad, going through the internet, encountering the firewall before they make it onto the corporate LAN. Physical controls. These prevent unauthorized individuals from gaining access to a company's facilities. For example, walls, doors, fencing, gates, and locks, badges, guards, and alarm systems, and pressure sensors, temperature sensors, and motion sensors. Access controls include logical controls, which are implemented by software. They help to provide controls such as authentication and authorization. Access and communication controls help to prevent identity theft. Using confidential information such as passwords, driver's licenses, or medical records to assume someone else's identity, which is the definition of identity theft. The thief applies for credit cards, mortgages, or passports. Example controls include physical security, access security, and encryption. The Office of the Privacy Commissioner of Canada tells businesses how to reduce the risk of identity theft and how to respond. And there's the website priv.gc.ca/English. Password controls need to be supported at all three control levels. Number one is control environment, policies that enforce the proper management of user codes and passwords. 2, at the general control level, a security system that requires a user ID and password in order to log on. And 3, at the functional application control, separate passwords for sensitive functions, for example, employee raises or write-off of customer accounts. Authentication can be in different formats. It can be something the user is, something the user has, something the user does, or something the user knows. So something the user is could be a thumbprint, a biometric of some sort, a retina scan. Something the user has is the RSA token. Something the user does could be signature or voice recognition. And something the user knows is passwords. Communication controls include firewalls, anti-malware systems, whitelisting and blacklisting, encryption, virtual private networking, or VPNs, transport layer security, TLS, employee monitoring systems. Whitelisting and blacklisting means taking IP addresses typically and allowing whitelisting or disallowing blacklisting them. Figure 4.3a, basic firewall for home computer, and figure 4.3b, organization with 2 firewalls and a demilitarized zone. A starts with a home computer with a software firewall, goes through an internet service provider to the internet. B has the corporate LAN through an internal firewall with a demilitarized zone between the 2 firewalls and then the external firewall on the other side of the servers between the servers and the internet. Figure 4.4, how public key encryption works. Public key encryption is used in a lot of applications, including things like the blockchain with Bitcoin or other cryptocurrencies. The way it works, we're going to use an example of Hannah and Harrison. So Hannah wants to send Harrison an encrypted message. Hannah has the message. Harrison has a 2-lockbox encryption method and both the locking key and the unlocking key. Harrison sends Hannah the 2-lockbox and the locking key. He keeps the unlocking key to himself. Hannah puts her message in the box and locks the box with her lock key. She then sends the message to Harrison. Only he can open it with his unlocking key. So in the example here, the locking key is publicly known. The unlocking key is the private part of the public and private key combination. Figure 4.5, how digital certificates work. Sony and Dell business partners use a digital certificate from VeriSign for authentication. It starts out with Sony requests a digital certificate from VeriSign. VeriSign creates a digital certificate for Sony. VeriSign transmits the digital certificate to Sony, and Sony presents the digital certificate to Dell for authentication purposes. Figure 4.6, virtual private network or VPN and tunneling. A lot of people that work remotely work through a VPN that allows them to work without having other people see what it is they're doing, unauthorized users, while using the internet, which is publicly accessible. It's a tunnel from your organization's intranet that contains data that goes to your business partner's intranet, and that business partner could be the remote worker or another company that is connected by VPN. Application controls are controls that apply to individual applications, functional areas, for instance, payroll. The text describes 3 categories: input, processing, and output application controls. It is more common to consider the purpose of application controls for input, processing, and output using accuracy, completeness, authorization, and an audit trail or documentation. Some examples of application controls. Input. Edits that check for reasonable data ranges, which is checking for accuracy. If we have an application control that checks the entry of a website form and someone puts in a visa number, for instance, and it's not in the reasonable data range, then it's not accurate and it would be rejected. Processing. Automatically check that each line of an invoice adds to the total. This type would make sure that the accuracy for the total and the completeness of line items. So you just make sure that as you're entering an invoice, that all the elements on the invoice add together. The output, the supervisor reviews payroll journal for unusual amounts, exceptions before checks are printed, which is authorization. So in my organization, I wouldn't review payroll checks so much as I would review every payables check that goes out to make sure that it's reasonable and matches to the data before applying my signature to the actual physical check. Business continuity planning, BCP. There has to be a disaster recovery plan that can include a hot site, a warm site, or a cold site. A hot site means that it's completely live. It's an exact mirror of your operating environment, which is obviously incredibly expensive to have 2 sites. A warm site is in the middle between a hot site and a cold site. A cold site is completely non-functional but can be brought up to speed if a disaster happened. When I worked in the States, we worked with Nike as a customer, and Nike had a complete hot site setup so that if their command center went down, their website would be able to continue to be active even if the physical location was, for instance, bombed. So they had a complete mirrored hot site that they could continue with at any time. The purpose of business continuity planning is to provide continuous availability and to be able to recover in the event of a hardware or software failure or an attack, for example, due to ransomware or due to terrorism, and to ensure that critical systems are available and operating. These sort of systems, for instance, Nike's website, are mission critical. They simply cannot be allowed to go down. Information systems auditing. There are different types of auditors and audits. How does the information system auditor decide on audits? Well, as a former auditor, I can tell you that audits are based on risk. There would be some sort of series of questioning or probing of the system, and the auditor would tend to have a template of different things to audit, but also would be making an assessment to see which to delve in most deeply, because auditing at the end of the day is sampling. It's not complete. You're not looking at 100% of all data, but a good auditor would look for areas of higher risk and use those as the areas to investigate more fully. Personal information asset protection. Before deciding upon potential actions you need to take, you need to do an inventory of information you are using, storing, or accessing. And you need to relate your inventory to a personal risk assessment. Use Table 4.4 to help enable changes to your methods of protecting your personal information assets. It's not a lot different than a corporate risk analysis in that you've got to see what the asset is worth, where it's stored, how it's being accessed, and what the repercussions or cost of it being revealed would be. Closing case, WannaCry, Petya, and SamSam ransomware. Here we'd like you to think about, where is your most recent backup and when was it done? What are the tangible and intangible costs associated with ransomware? That brings us to the end of this chapter's lecture. Thank you for your attention.